Hello, I'm Janessa and welcome to my channel. In this video, we are continuing coverage of the Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni lawsuit. If you saw my latest video, you know that at the very end of the astrological analysis, I called out some specific upcoming transits for this week that I thought would be really interesting to follow. I said make sure to pay attention to what happens on Monday, May 19th and Tuesday, May 20th. And sure enough, we had some major developments with sanctions in the case. We'll get into more of those details in a moment, and we'll break down the specific astrology that I had a glimpse of that turned out to be pretty significant. And we'll bump that up against Blake Lively's birth chart and Justin Baldoni's birth chart. But before we do, I want to say thank you so much for being here. If you've been following this channel for a while, it is so wonderful to connect with you again. And if you're new here, please drop a comment below and say hello. I'd love to hear from you. And of course, if you're not subscribed yet, please subscribe to my channel. That is one of the best ways that you can show me that you enjoy this content. And without further ado, let's get into the analysis of some of the events already stirring up a lot of conflict and speculation this week. We will specifically look at the legal documents that were filed in the last few days, and we'll analyze the astrology surrounding them. As usual, we will head over to courtlistener.com so we can look at the documents specifically filed in this case. And I know even today, as I record this on Thursday, May 22nd, I noticed there's been a flurry of new documents filed. But like I said, we're specifically focusing in this video on the events of May 19th and May 20th. And we might, if we have time, look at some of the documents that were filed yesterday on May 21st. So let's scroll down. I have this organized according to descending, so we can see the latest documents up front. And let's go back to May 19th. Okay, so the first thing we want to take a look at related to the sanctions. We have filing number 222 and 223. We will open up 223 because that's the actual memo of law in support of the motion that Blake Lively's side is bringing for sanctions against the Wayfarer parties. Not all of them, not including Justin Baldoni, but basically every other party in the case. So you'll see here on my screen, I have document 223, and this is Blake Lively's memo. This is a really long document. This is 30 pages. So as I scroll down, you'll see we're trying to get to the introduction of the document, and we're not going to do a detailed review of everything. If you want to take a closer look, of course, you can go online and find this publicly. We really just want to pull out a few of the key points from the introduction, enough to know what substantially happened, so we can bring that into our astrological analysis, which will come after we review the legal documents. And I'll read this out loud just because I find it helpful for me to process, and maybe it helps you too. So let's start with this first paragraph. Defendant Blake Lively brings this motion for sanctions pursuant to Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 11, known as Rule 11, requesting the court to impose monetary sanctions against plaintiffs Steve Sarowitz, Jamie Heath, Melissa Nathan, Jennifer Abel, and It Ends With Us Movie LLC, their attorneys Brian Friedman and Mitchell Schuster, and their attorneys' respective law firms, Liner Friedman Tatelman and Cooley LLP, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and Meister Seelig and Fine PLLC. So Blake Lively's side is asking the court, essentially asking Judge Lyman to rule in their favor to impose monetary or financial sanctions against the parties, not including Justin Baldoni. And let's just scroll down and read a little bit of the introduction to get a flavor or a hint of the tone and some of the reasons why they're saying they should have this granted. I'll continue reading in the introduction. The Rule 11 plaintiffs and counsel have asserted in the amended complaint claims against Ms. Lively that have no reasonable basis in law or fact and clearly were brought for an improper purpose. Rule 11 exists to discourage precisely these types of claims because federal courts are venues for the adjudication of justice, not playgrounds for retribution or public relations. Every lawyer certifies under Rule 11 that the pleadings they file with the court are not, quote, frivolous, legally unreasonable, or factually without foundation, end quote, and are, quote, not being presented for any improper purposes, such as to harass, cause unnecessary delay, or needlessly increase the cost of litigation, end quote. Failing to meet these standards subjects both lawyers and their clients to sanctions. The Rule 11 plaintiffs and their counsel have violated Rule 11 in every respect. So that paragraph definitely comes out swinging. And of course, I am not a legal expert. I am a layperson just like you trying to make sense of this. I highly recommend, if you want more of a breakdown of the legal considerations behind this, to follow some of the creators out there who are actual lawyers covering the case. A couple of my favorites include Ask Two Lawyers and Not Actually Golden, which was suggested to me by a subscriber not that long ago, so thank you, you know who you are. I've really enjoyed her content. I'm not on TikTok, but I can at least see what she reposts from TikTok onto YouTube, and that has been incredibly helpful as I've been wrapping my head around the legal developments in the case. But I think what's important for our analysis from an astrology perspective is to establish, and what you may already know, is that Blake Lively's side is saying there should be financial sanctions for the Wayfarer parties because they're saying what's brought against them from those specific parties, it's either frivolous, legally unreasonable, or factually without foundation. Essentially, that's the argument they're making. Now, you can come up with your own opinion on whether or not you agree with that, but that is the argument at hand. Now, if we go back to the docket, let's see what else happened, because that was on Monday, May 19th, and we'll get more into this during the astrological analysis, but it was around that day, the 19th and 20th, that I had called out to say, hey, let's pay attention to this because Mars, if we have an accurate birth time for Blake Lively, is just about to make an exact conjunction with her ascendant. And I thought that would be important because Mars is a planet associated with conflict and actions, sometimes of the aggressive nature. But let's keep looking at the docket because I believe it was the 20th actually that aspect went exact. And lo and behold, what's really interesting is if we scroll up, we're not going to pay attention to all these documents. Like I said, we're going to focus in on the sanctions. Gosh, there was so much filed those couple of days. I really do want to go back and do a more detailed review. It looks like there were a few motions to compel, but let's get to the 20th because this was the next event. Ryan Reynolds filed his motion for sanctions. Essentially the same thing that Blake Lively filed against the same parties from what I understand. But let's go ahead and open document 230, which is the memo of law in support of his motion for sanctions. So you'll see here, this is document 230. And again, we're not going to look at this in detail, but let's scroll to the beginning and I will skip over that first paragraph because it's basically saying the exact same thing as the Blake Lively document, except just insert Ryan Reynolds. And let's see if there's anything else in the introduction that would be interesting to note that's different. Okay, here's a detail that might be interesting from a timeline perspective. I'll just read through the first few sentences. It's going to be very similar to Blake's. Counsel for the Wayfarer parties and 5 of their clients, Steve Sarowitz, Jamie Heath, Melissa Nathan, Jennifer Abel, and It Ends With Us Movie LLC, filed an amended complaint asserting claims for civil extortion, defamation, and tortious interference against Mr. Reynolds that do not and cannot exist. Mr. Reynolds provided the Rule 11 plaintiffs and their counsel an opportunity to save face, explaining these claims' glaring and fundamental defects and urging that they be withdrawn more than 21 days ago. Unfortunately, the Rule 11 plaintiffs and their counsel unequivocally refused to do so, offering no response on these defects except to argue that these issues are appropriately resolved by motion to dismiss and may later be supported by discovery. So if I can try to interpret this as an average person, it seems like there was notice of the Rule 11 sanctions, that they would be forthcoming. I believe I heard maybe it was Not Actually Golden talk about that, how any party intending to bring a motion for sanctions has to notify the other side. And so that was a little over 21 days ago. We don't have time to go back and look at that astrology, but if you're curious, I would say, do the math, go back like 21 to 24 days, see what was going on. And what I do find interesting about the point around the motion to dismiss and what I've heard some lawyers say, these arguments that they're bringing up in the motion for sanctions are very similar to some of the rationale that they're bringing up in the motions to dismiss from the case. Because you probably recall that we are still waiting to hear back from the judge regarding multiple motions to dismiss from the case, including a motion from Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds. Now, there are lawyer content creators evaluators, again, getting into the legal considerations and strategical or tactical reasons why these sanctions might be requested right now, but I'll just highlight that because it seems like an important point. And let's go back to the docket again, because although the motions for sanctions were significant on the 19th and 20th, there were a couple other events that I thought might be worth noting for our astrological analysis. Okay, yes, if we get to the filings, I think they're called filings, I don't know, whatever the number is. We have 232 and 233 here. These seemed important, so we'll briefly touch on this as well. We have a letter motion to compel James Fituska, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, to produce documents. And then we also have for 233 a letter response in opposition to the motion to compel Wayfair Studios, and I think this is specifically related to the investigation that Wayfair Studios LLC as a company is doing after the fact, an investigation into the claims that Blake Lively raised. And from what I understand, that independent, or at least trying to make it as independent as possible, that investigation is happening in parallel to this litigation, to this lawsuit. So let's open up these documents. Let's start with 232. Okay, document 232. So this is the motion to compel against James Fituska, who, as I understand it, is a journalist who was doing work for the Daily Mail, and he was caught up somehow in communication with Wayfair parties. And this is surrounding, from what I understand, those claims of defamation that Justin Baldoni is bringing against Leslie Sloan and Vision PR. And what I think is important to note from an astrological perspective before we get into that analysis is that this journalist, Fituska, said that Leslie Sloan allegedly, and actually let's highlight it here because this is important, that the thrust of the Wayfair party's claims against Ms. Sloan is that she allegedly told Fituska that Blake Lively was SA'd. Now, this is a really important point that I think is going to get a lot of attention when it comes to the role of Leslie Sloan and some of the media coverage, because the claims that Blake Lively brought were for SH, and that is very different than SA. And you can probably tell I'm using the acronym because I don't want this video to get negatively impacted by saying certain words that YouTube doesn't like. So we'll keep saying SA. And so I believe this motion to compel is Leslie Sloan's side saying we want this information that we've outlined from Fituska, because it's their argument that it was not Leslie Sloan to say that, but that it was Fituska saying the SA. I think the other point we want to note is, let's just scroll down. So there's this question, and I'll be honest, and we're getting to the limits of my understanding as an average person on some of these things, but it does seem like this reporter's privilege question is quite important, because it says here that Fituska invoked the reporter's privilege as grounds to refuse to comply with the Sloan party's document requests. And the Sloan parties are now saying, well, hold up, he actually waived that privilege, so it doesn't apply here. I don't know about you, but to me, this just sounds kind of messy and seems like a lot that has to be unpacked here, especially considering this is brought against him as an individual, and it doesn't seem that the Daily Mail is actually involved in this particular subpoena and motion to compel. So those are the four main documents that I saw that I thought were interesting. Drop a comment below though and let me know if you think I missed anything, but essentially we have Blake Lively's motion for sanctions, Ryan Reynolds' motion for sanctions. We have Lively's motion to compel around the Wayfair company investigation into her claims, where basically she's saying, hey, we want this information that in theory they're gathering as part of the investigation, and the Wayfair parties are saying we don't have access to that, that's an independent firm doing it. And then finally the fourth one here is this motion to compel that Sloan is bringing up against Fituska, the reporter. So let's get into the astrological analysis and start to connect some dots. I'm sharing my screen so you can see the transits as of noon on May May 19th in New York, New York. And I use that location for this case because the developments are centered around the New York district and what is being overseen by federal Judge Lyman. And as I said in my last update video for the case, I called out specifically this trine that I saw starting to come to a head between Mars in Leo and Venus in Aries. And this is interesting, and you can even take a look at your own chart to see where this lands in your chart. This is a trine, so it's an opening of energy, a flow of energy, and it's between two planets that often are seen in relationship with one another because they symbolize opposing forces. Mars is the planet that severs, that separates, and that's why it's associated with things around conflict, aggression, and why it can also be associated with punishment or injury of some kind. Venus, on the other hand, has the opposite force. It brings things together. It's about bonding, attachment, adherence. And that's often why it can be associated with relationships. But it also brings in an element of money and resources, our assets and our values. And if we put the charts in here, let's add Blake Lively's chart and put her birth chart in the middle ring. And then around that, we have the transits for the 19th. This is what I saw that really piqued my interest. You'll see that this trine between Mars and Leo and Venus in Aries, it's activating specifically her ascendant at 15 degrees of Leo, assuming we have an accurate birth time. This also means, though, that this Mars, and this was the piece that didn't quite click for me yet until I saw what happened with both Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds this week, is whenever a planet is conjunct our ascendant, which symbolizes us, like the individual within the birth chart, that means it is automatically opposite the descendant, which is often associated with our partner. That could be a romantic partner, like a husband or a wife, boyfriend, girlfriend. It could also be business partners or very close friends, essentially those closest partners to us in life. The other piece I want to call out, though, that I realized after coming back to her chart for these days, and I was seeing more of the developments, is that not only is this Mars in Leo activating her ascendant and her descendant, and Mars is forming a trine with Venus, which also means that Venus is forming a trine with her ascendant, and Venus is forming a sextile with her descendant. We also have Mars in her first house forming this trine with Saturn at 14 degrees of Sagittarius, which of course also then means that Venus in the sky at 13 degrees of Aries is forming a trine with her natal Saturn. What this is doing is it's connecting her first house of self, her seventh house of partner, with her ninth house and her fifth house. I think it's pretty obvious that the astrology of the first house and the seventh house, that's being reflected in the motions to sanction from both Blake Lively, first house, and Ryan Reynolds. What is her partner doing? The seventh house. And it's being colored by this very martial, aggressive energy. I mean, sanctions are calling for some sort of penalty for someone. And that seems to line up with Mars and a lot of its symbolism. But in addition to that, we also have the ninth house, which is where Venus is located for this transit for Blake. And the ninth house is associated with publishing, news and media publishing. And so to me, that's pretty significant because it's also bringing in that element of the motion to compel against the journalist that was at least associated with the Daily Mail. Even though the motion to compel isn't coming from Blake Lively directly, it's coming from Leslie Sloan. Keep in mind, again, that Venus signifies relationships, and so Leslie Sloan is one of those relationships in Blake Lively's life. So we have the embodiment of Venus and relationships in the ninth house, also accentuating everything that's going on and being reflected in that motion to compel against James Fatuska. What's also interesting to know is, remember that one of the key points that's being debated is who said Blake Lively was SA'd. Was that James, the journalist, or was that Leslie Sloan? The journalist says it was Leslie Sloan, and that's what he communicated to some of the Wayfair parties. And Leslie Sloan, of course, is saying, I never said that, he said that. And this, I think, is showing us the connection with the fifth house and Saturn for Blake Lively, because the fifth house is associated with sex and sexual matters. So that seems to be a strong connection with some of the content and the words and the discussions happening right now, and who said what, and how does that play into into some of these broader arguments that Justin Baldoni's bringing forward about defamation against him, because SA did not happen. Blake Lively is not saying or claiming anything around SA, and SA is an escalated version of SH with a different level of potentially negative impact for Justin Baldoni if that were something that was being communicated, whether or not it was publicly or to particular people with interests and the power to influence Justin Baldoni in a negative way. So that's a lot just right there with Blake Lively's chart. Let's go ahead and switch over to Justin Baldoni's chart so we can see as well how this is activating his planets and his placements. So you'll see for him it's a little different. Mars in Leo is in the 12th house, assuming he is Virgo rising, which I believe that's something that he's confirmed over social media at some point. So that means that his 12th house and Venus in Aries in his 8th house, they're forming that trine, the Mars and the Venus. And the other point that I think is really important to call out with Justin Baldoni's chart is that he has Saturn at 15 degrees of Scorpio, which means this Mars is also building up to an aspect with one of his natal planets, but this time it's a square, which is a much more challenging aspect in some regards. And overall, if we advance this a day, you'll see Mars getting closer. It's moving to 15 degrees. And then I believe it was today at some point, May 22nd, when the Mars and Venus trine went exact. So all of this energy was really building up to today in a sense. And how is this showing up based on Justin's house placements? Well, the 8th house concerns other people's money from Justin's perspective. It's not his direct money or finances. And keep in mind how the sanctions are targeted at all the other Wayfair parties. They're not against Justin. So literally financial sanctions, some sort of penalty for other people he's been closely associated with as part of this lawsuit. I mean, that seems like a pretty clear 8th house signification. And in addition to that, we also have what was going on, of course, with the journalist, which I think it's interesting that for Justin Baldoni, Saturn is in Scorpio in his 3rd house of communication. And I believe the subpoena is specifically related to communications, like text messages, written communication between this journalist and also, I think it was Melissa Nathan, if I remember correctly, who's an associate of Baldoni and also now a party to the lawsuit. So that seems like a pretty clear signification and reflection of the 3rd house in communication. Now, the piece that I'm still noodling on, and drop a comment below, let me know what you think, is the significance of the 12th house for Justin Baldoni when it comes to these events. Because the 12th house is often associated with enemies. And of course, I mean, that's related to how all these parties on opposite sides likely view each other in that way. At an extreme, an enemy, and at a minimum, someone whose interests are obviously not aligned with yours, who's trying to win a lawsuit against you. In addition to that, the 12th house can be associated with themes around isolation, loss, injury, and also actions that come about by force. And I'm calling back to what I've learned from Chris Brennan on that one. I believe he specifically talks about that in his book on Hellenistic astrology, how the 12th house can be connected to, again, actions that come about by force. So this motion to compel, the motion to sanction, all of that seems quite relevant for the 12th house. I also wonder a little bit when it comes to this Wayfair company investigation that was referenced as well. You know, the 12th house is opposite to the 6th house. And although Justin Baldoni doesn't have any specific planets in the middle range of his 6th house in Aquarius, he does have his sun in the early degrees of Aquarius. And right now, Pluto is in the early degrees of Aquarius. So it's possible that maybe the 12th house is also pulling in 6th house themes of work and workplace issues. And perhaps the 12th house could also be connected to some sense of going behind what is visible, behind the veil. That is the nature of an investigation, right? We're digging deeper. We're trying to move aside what has potentially been blocking some sort of revelation revelation or finding or recommendation or truth and getting to the bottom of something. So that's a little bit of a looser interpretation, but it's possible that that's in play as well. Thank you so much for joining me for this analysis. I would love to hear what you think about the developments of the last few days. Drop a comment below and let me know what stands out to you. And again, if you're not subscribed, please subscribe, like the video. I know there was another flurry of documents filed today on May 22nd, which may or may not be interesting from an astrological perspective. I'll have to see what officially came through today, but I do believe today was the exact conjunction between Mars and Venus. So there could be some more to unpack there. Also, let me know if there are any other pop culture stories that you find interesting. It's very possible that there will be enough material and content from the Lively and Baldoni case that I wouldn't necessarily have to look at another case or another celebrity story, but I'm very curious if there's anything out there that would be worth it. And really the ideal is stories involving individuals with a reliable birth time. But I will say, I'll be honest, I don't know if I have it in me to cover the Diddy case. Personally, the mental and emotional load that would be might be a little too much for me to dive into. But that's where it would be helpful to hear from you to see if there's anything else that might be good to look at. Thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to connecting again soon.